Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. We know that who holds the top editorial positions at news outlets matters. And this year, we've seen the first women top editors at places like Reuters and Fortune. Still, as an industry, we have some catching up to do. I was just reading a Reuters Institute report from last year that found that only 23% of the top editors across 200 major news organizations surveyed are women. Advancing female leaders in business journalism is the mission of the Xana Fund, created to honor the work of Xana Antunes, who many of us know held top roles at Quartz, CNBC, Fortune, and the New York Post. And in fact, she was on track to be the president of SABEW before she passed away in January 2020. Talking with us today about the landscape for women in business journalism are Catherine Bell, editor-in-chief of Quartz, Julie Pace, the executive editor of the Associated Press, and Ellen Pollock, business editor of the New York Times. Also with us are several of our Xana Fellows, a program created last year by the Xana Fund to offer leadership development to 10 aspiring leaders in our field. I'm going to involve them in asking the questions today, and hopefully technology will allow all of that to work. So let's get started. What we're going to do is talk a little bit about recruiting and retaining women in our profession. How do women advance their careers, especially amid a pandemic? And one of the things we've talked an awful lot with the Xana Fellows over the last year is this notion of redefining ambition and kind of future-proofing your career. So let's get started. Claire, do you want to ask the first question?
Sure, thanks for having me. So I'm sure all of our organizations at some point have done stories on the number of women who've left the workforce during the pandemic. Can you tell us a bit about what you as a leader and your organization as a whole has done to recruit and especially retain women and especially moms and caregivers who've been dealing with virtual school and endless COVID tests that are hopefully on their way out?
Just jump in.
I'm happy to, go ahead, Catherine, go ahead.
Oh, I can get started. We are at Quartz, an entirely remote organization now. We're global, and so we had a lot of people working from home even before the pandemic. Most of the people working from home did not have children in their homes at the time, but we ended up adjusting really quickly to that. And I think one of the things that has really helped is our entire executive team have fairly small children at home. I think mine are the oldest and mine are 8 and 10. And so I think one of the things that's been really important, and one reason it's important to have both women and men who are involved in their children's lives in very senior positions in your organization, is that seeing chaos in executives' lives take place on Zoom calls, I think has been one of the things that has really helped. Everybody in my company and on some panels have seen my kids not always behaving particularly well in the background. Once one of my daughters dropped a blanket on my head in the middle of an executive meeting. I often do my calls from in front of her bunk bed, which is very dangerous. And I think that's been really important for us. And then obviously, just being really flexible about timing, reminding people about things like Zoom fatigue and allowing people to turn their cameras off so that they can take care of other things while they're working. Having really good procedures for asynchronous work so that people can work when they need to. And then I think the last thing is also taking care of the non-parents so that they don't feel like they're taking over all of the work. And then, when there's sort of guilt and resentment that goes on for a long time over that can cause problems too. So remembering that other people have lives that are important too. And we've had a lot of people have other caregiving responsibilities as well with parents and especially with COVID.
Yeah, I agree with so much of what Catherine just said. I think a big lesson that I've taken from this last 18 months or so is the importance of talking honestly as a leader about what's happening in your own life. I have a 3-year-old. My 3-year-old, just yesterday, I was running a meeting of our senior leadership team at the AP, and my 3-year-old was sitting on my lap during that meeting over Zoom because my nanny was running late. And that was just the reality of my morning that day. And so I think if we talk honestly as leaders, then it gives people permission to talk about what they need and what the stresses in their lives are. It means that you have to think about the makeup of your leadership team, being able to have people on that team who are balancing a lot of things, whether it is kids or caring for parents or any number of responsibilities that they have. I also have found that there are people on, and I'm sure everyone has had this experience, there are people on my team who have really thrived with having more flexibility, who are doing better at their jobs when they're able to know that they can maybe work a few hours in the morning and then a few hours at night, and they can structure their day in a way that makes the most sense for them. Obviously, we work in news and that's not always possible, but making it possible wherever we can, I think has really increased productivity. It has made people feel more of a connection, I think, to their news organization, knowing that there's just that ability to have an honest conversation about what works and what doesn't. And I really hope that that continues when we eventually move past the pandemic.
This is the first sort of crisis of this kind that I can remember where it seemed like the men had as much responsibility for the kids as the women. The men who worked for me seemed like they were scrambling as much as the women. It really felt like equally allocated hell for everybody. And we had to remind editors to bear in mind that there were people who were not going to be available. And once we sort of knew that some people had childcare in the morning and some people had childcare in the afternoon, people kind of got used to it. And I think, it makes a big difference when people see, men with unruly children on their laps. Because I can remember a time, the first time I was ever at a meeting, this is like years and years ago at the Wall Street Journal, where a man got called out of the room, came back in and said, my kid is sick and I have to pick them up at school. And that wasn't really that long ago, but I'd never seen a guy excuse himself with childcare as the issue before. So it's a huge change. And I think it makes a big difference to see, men dealing with unruly children.
I think that's probably, it makes a lot of sense that extra degree of flexibility afforded by the way we're working now has really been beneficial in a lot of ways. One of the things that's a topic that's come up a lot with our fellows over the last year is kind of a different framing of that, which is managing a team effectively in this environment, and also advancing. There's a different dynamic around making sure that your managers are considering you for new opportunities, or how do you make sure that you're positioning yourself properly to advance or have those chances. And I'm wondering if we can talk about that aspect a little bit. How do you get seen and make yourself known to be available for advancement?
This is one of the things that I worry about quite a bit as we start talking about what the future of work looks like. Our model at AP, and I think a lot of news organizations, we're talking about some sort of hybrid model where we'll be in a few days a week, we'll be remote or flexible, other times of the week. And how do you make sure, especially in, for those of us who work in, really intense kind of breaking news situations, how do you make sure that you don't just default to the people who are physically in front of you, that you remember that there actually is staff who are working and you've given them the choice and the opportunity to work not physically in front of you? How do you make sure that you are giving them the same opportunities? How do you account for that kind of casual conversation and relationship building that happens when everybody is in a room together, when again you are telling people that it is okay, that they will not be punished or their standing will not be diminished by being at home? I think we're going to have to, some of this is going to be a process of figuring out how that works. And I don't think we know all the answers. I think as leaders, we just have to be really, really attuned to the risks of having a staff that is split, that is working in hybrid mode. I hope that, again, as news leaders, that we can make that a conversation that we're having with each other. I want to learn from how other people are doing this. I hope that we can speak really honestly about what's working and what's not, because there is going to be a process of all of us really figuring this sort of brave new world out together.
I think it's going to be a real challenge. And I think it's definitely going to be harder for people working at home. And I think it's kind of the responsibility of women leaders to make sure that people don't get kind of lost in the shadows, because that's so, it could happen so easily, because there's still, men who, when they think about who's the best person for an assignment, they automatically think about men. It just happens too much still. And, you have to find ways to be visible. You can't assume that you're going to be plucked. And whether that means, setting up meetings with, newsroom leaders, making sure people know your name, making sure people know your work. I mean, I hate to say it, but sucking up works, and making sure that people in power actually know who you are and know when you've done a good job. I think it's going to become, more important. And I think, at the Times, our rule is going to be, you have to be in 3 days a week. And, I think that's going to end up being, important, because I think visibility really matters. And if you aren't, going to be routinely visible, you have to find different ways to be visible.
I mean, for us, we're really thinking about making sure that there are ways, because for a lot of our staff, they won't be hybrid, because we have lots of people who are the only person in a city or the only person in a country. And it's really important to us that those people are just as visible and have just as many opportunities, both to do interesting work and to advance as anybody who's in a place where we have a critical mass of people. And I think it's going to take more effort, both on behalf of people. So you really need to, be brave about reaching out to people you don't know in the newsroom, and make sure you know your boss's boss as well as your boss, and volunteer for things, and volunteer for visible things, and volunteer for things that you are a little scared of and that you maybe don't feel like you have the skills to do. That's something men always volunteer for, things that they don't think they can do, and they do them anyway. And women need to do more of that as well. But I think it's really important for the organization to very actively create those opportunities as well. And I mean, we've found, as we lifted our hiring, we hire people from anywhere where we're allowed to do business legally in the world. And so we don't just have people now in countries because they're reporting from those countries. We have people reporting on other things from places because they're just the best person we found for that job. And it's meant that we've been able to hire incredible people, and our newsroom is more diverse. And so we'll be a stronger organization the more we make sure that people all around the world and all around the country as well in the US have just as much opportunity. So for us, we're not just thinking about remote, we're thinking about truly asynchronous, because we have people in wildly different time zones. We want to make sure that they're visible as well.
Ellen, I want to pick up on something you said, because Aaron, one of our fellows, has a question that kind of relates to that. I mean, when you talk about needing to be more intentional, or making sure your managers know what you're doing and about your successes and things like that, not necessarily something women in particular are maybe accustomed to doing, that kind of sales job for themselves. Aaron, I think your question is appropriate here if you want to jump in and ask that.
Sure, can you hear me okay? Great, so I was wondering, has the pandemic changed the way job seekers and employees try to get on your radar for future opportunities or promotions? If so, how, and what are some of the most effective approaches that you've seen? Maybe you could give some specific examples that you've seen that some people today might model?
I don't know if I'm seeing people come up with different approaches. My approach has changed a little bit, I would say. My approach to recruiting has become much more long-term in the last couple of years. I set up a mini recruiting committee in my department that is not just editors, it's reporters as well. So we can identify and talk to people who we might otherwise miss. Often these are people who are not necessarily looking for a job, but we want to keep, we like their work and we want to talk, we want to talk to them. And so in some cases, these are relationships that, haven't come to fruition yet, but we're sort of in loose contact with these people and we're watching them. And the pandemic has just sort of underscored to me that's important, because I've found that needs have changed during the pandemic, and as you look forward, what you thought was important in 2019 may not be as important, and new things come up. So it's good to have a pipeline of people that you're thinking about, even if, again, they're not like immediately asking for jobs. So I think it's good to get on people's radars and establish a relationship with them, even if there's not an immediate opening that you want. And I think, even though I didn't come up with that during the pandemic, it has helped it has actually helped during the pandemic, because I have filled a few roles, and in part by thinking about the future and who I'm going to need and getting to know people. But in terms of how people are trying to get on my radar, it has stayed remarkably the same.
One thing I have noticed that has changed a bit is I think that people are more willing to put their hands up or reach out about a job that maybe didn't seem like it was a perfect fit for them because of location pre-pandemic. So, this doesn't apply everywhere, of course. If we're hiring somebody to cover the White House, for example, you do need to be in Washington so you can go to the White House. But I've had people reach out when we've had a job that, let's say, is posted for New York or London, and say, here's my experience, here's why I think I could do this job, and here's why I think I could do it from another location. And as you talk it through with them, oftentimes you realize, that makes perfect sense. That's totally fine for you to do that job from another location. And so I think people have been a little bit more proactive and almost pushed us to think about jobs in a different way, and to think about what actually is possible. And I hope, again, that this is something that we continue. I think it's good for the industry. The more people who can get out of New York, Washington, and London, the better. So I hope that this is a longer term trend. But I also just like the idea of people looking at these positions and thinking, I'd be really good at this, and I've got a better way or a different way that you could tackle this.
I think we're definitely more, as Catherine said, we're definitely more flexible about where we're going to hire somebody. That if somebody's in LA, but we want them, we'll be more apt to do it. Although, I don't know, we still really view 620 8th Avenue as sort of the nerve center, even though we have obviously have people like all over the world. There still is this desire to keep this as the real nerve center.
I want to talk a little bit about style, or the idea of presenting as an effective manager and as someone who has the potential to take on even more senior roles. Anything from, I think often, here's an issue that I personally struggle with, so I'll ask a question before our Xana fellows do. Sometimes I feel like I say yes too much to tasks or things that ultimately are not serving the goals, but maybe I actually like them and want to do them, or maybe I just want to be a team player. And so, you know, I'm wondering what you all think about balancing, you know, really being sort of hyper focused on not just your own path, but actually doing the job and meeting the goals that you need to do versus, you know, kind of being able to have that time to do other things or serve the community or, you know, develop different kinds of skills.
I think it really does need to be a balance. And that problem of saying yes to too many things is so common that we just actually wrote an email all about how to say no more and sent it to all of our members last Friday, which I can send it to you. But it is a huge problem. Having said that, I think it's really important to show kind of interest and curiosity and ideas beyond where, you know, beyond the real focus that's just the focus of your job, in part because it's important, you know, it's important to understand the whole project of what the newsroom's doing and understand the readers. And, you know, for us, we're such a collaborative newsroom that's something that's incredibly important. And then another thing that I think is really important is having a voice outside the newsroom. And, you know, that's been increasingly important lately. It's certainly not required at all, but I think, you know, you'll hear more about other opportunities if you're going to events like this and meeting people. And again, it's harder to do when it's all remote in some ways, but it's also way easier to do. You can go to more things. The one other thing I would say is that I think as organizations, we need to make sure that we're not basing too much on the extra stuff you do outside of your job, even though I'm saying like showing that interest and curiosity and aptitude is really important. I mean, you know, when I was growing up as a journalist, it was just, you know, you sort of did your job and then you did a ton of work beyond that. And that was where you proved yourself. And that was where you tried new things. And you didn't ever get another job until you were doing it already in your own time. And that obviously is really exclusionary in all sorts of ways to parents and anyone who has other stuff going on outside work. So I think balancing those things are really important for an organization to think about.
I once got a really great piece of advice from a mentor, Lisa, that I think kind of gets to the heart of what you're talking about here. And she told me, you know, start off every year and make sure that you have a clear mission statement for your job, like what your actual job is, and then have your own personal mission statement. And everything you say yes to should fall into one of those two buckets, right? So either it's part of my mission because this is actually my job every day and this is what I'm getting paid to do, or it helps me in my personal mission. Because sometimes you want to say yes to things that are outside of the purview of your job, and that's great. But you can stop yourself from saying yes to everything if you've got a rationale, right? It could just be my personal mission statement for the year includes finding opportunities to do things that I just like and I find fun, right? Does it fall into that category? Check. Or my personal mission statement for this year is going to involve, you know, this is the year I'm going to take a step forward in my career. Is this going to help me do that? And I've always loved that piece of advice because when I look at that Zoom invite or that email from somebody, I will still do this. I'll say, does it fall into one of those two buckets? Yes, great. No, don't have time for it. So that's one, again, a piece of advice that was passed on to me that I've tried to pass on to other people over the years.
You know, I mean, I think that's great advice because I think women say yes too often. And you know, there's a fine line between, you know, contributing and being exploited. And, you know, a lot of women will do whatever is necessary and whatever it needs to be done, right? And if you're doing whatever needs to be done, you end up doing, you know, tasks that aren't necessarily that may be very important, but they're not, you know, showing off your skills or your ability to think big, which is not to say that you should never do it. Of course you should do it because part of what you need to show is that you can work hard and get things done. But some of what you should be saying yes to is stuff that shows that you can think big and have vision. And if you're saying yes to a million tasks that may be important, but are all about getting things done, you're not going to have the opportunity to show that you can think big, that you can think ahead, and that you can be a leader. And I just see like lots of women being caught in that trap. And you know, again, you have to do some of it, and you should do some of it, and some of it's even fun and good for you, and that's how you learn skills. But you gotta balance it, because you don't want to be the person who's called upon all the time to make trains run on time if you're not interested in ultimately making trains run on time. And again, that's not to say that's not important, but if it doesn't have to do, you know, if it's not really going to get you where you want to go, and it's just going to make you someone they're like, oh, well, let's get so-and-so, they'll make the trains run on time, you should think about whether you want to say yes to all that.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. Jennifer, you want to step in here? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say really quickly, you can also make a really specific culture of encouraging men to call each other out on that office housekeeping thing, which is something that I've seen at Quartz, which I love, where the men it was a big issue, and women started calling men out when women would always step in to do the kind of taking notes and things. And now it's something everybody's aware of, and men sometimes step in and notice when it's happening and call, you know, call on each other, which is great.
Basically, women should never agree to take notes.
I agree with that.
That's great. Jennifer, go ahead.
Sure, thank you. So something that feels especially challenging to me right now with less time face-to-face, as we've been talking about, is how to talk through issues and include many perspectives without being seen as perhaps a little bit wishy-washy in the process. So my question for everybody, do you have advice on how to present a management style as both a decision maker and a consensus builder in this current environment?
It's a really good question. I mean, I feel like this is where, when we talk about flexibility and we talk about, you know, being open to remote work, I find difficult management conversations, right? Difficult conversations where you got to reach, someone's got to ultimately make the decision, right? And it's either going to be Catherine or Ellen or myself who's got to make the decision. I find those hard to do over Zoom. I really do. I find that it's harder to read body language. It's harder to know when to let the conversation flow, when to insert yourself. It's hard to know when do people want to keep talking about this, or have we reached a point where we're done? I have struggled with that. I think that those are the types of things that I already, as we've started to go back, you know, a couple days a week, just voluntarily, when we have something tough like that, we are trying to do it more in person. And it just, I can almost feel the weight off my shoulder. I can just, all the cues that I need to make the decision are so much easier there. So I'm not really answering your question other than to say, I agree with you. This is one of the real challenges. And again, I think if we want to commit to the idea of flexibility, like these are the types of things we just, I think, should be honest about. Hey guys, this is the type of conversation that I'm not sure we can have over Zoom, right? How does everybody feel about, you know, if we're all in the same place, being able to have this conversation in person? Is that going to be possible? You know, is there another way that we can have this conversation that will get us to a more productive place? Again, I don't know what the answer to that ultimately is, but I think being honest about the limitations of this format is a perfectly reasonable thing to do.
And I'm not sure I would worry about seeming wishy-washy. I mean, you know, the great thing about men is they know that they always know they're right. Have you ever met a man who's wrong, who is wrong? They're never wrong. They're always right. And that's actually one of their weaknesses. And one of the strengths of a lot of women leaders is that they do know how. They're not afraid to ask questions, and they're not afraid to change their mind, but they're very good. I mean, I know this is like a gross generalization, so just excuse me, but you know, it like asking people what they think before you make a decision is actually, you know, is smart decision making. And so, you know, I just think it's, you know, you shouldn't view it as a weakness. You should view it as a strength, and it leads to better decisions, and it leads to decisions that people feel better about because they know they've been brought into the decision. I mean, look, a lot of decisions end up being made by one person, but if you can get to a point where a whole bunch of people have thought they've participated in it, that's a better place to be. And so I don't think you should view it as a weakness. I think you should view it as a strength.
I think I agree with everything you both just said. I would just add that I think one thing that being remote forces us to do, I agree that some of the tricky, especially conflict-oriented decisions are much easier to have, or really sensitive ones are much easier to have in person. And I hate not being able to read body language. But I do think that it forces you to be more explicit about things, and including how decisions are made in ways that are actually good for organizations, even if everyone's in person all the time. So in those situations, I think as leaders, we can forget that other people don't quite understand what we're asking from them and understand how the decision is going to be made. And I think setting out that sort of thing can be really helpful, both in terms of getting the input that you need and helping people know how to be helpful, but also in sort of taking the pressure off them in some ways. So I will sometimes say, especially if it's a decision where, the outcome is going to be, negative in some way or hard in some way, I will say, I will ultimately make this decision, but I really want input from each of you in this way. And then that way, it's sort of the best of both worlds, and it makes it really clear. And that's just one example. There can be all sorts of examples where we say, ideally, we make this decision as consensus, but you kind of know what the goal is going in. It's really helpful.
It's really great advice. Laura, you had a question too.
Yeah. Any advice on how women of color can speak up in the newsroom without being labeled difficult or aggressive? And do these experiences contribute to whether women of color are considered for news leadership positions?
What's wrong with being aggressive? I don't understand this whole thing with, oh, you don't want to seem aggressive. I hear this all the time. Yes, you should embrace being aggressive. That doesn't answer your question. I'll let somebody else talk.
Well, we're not all Ellen Pollock, I think.
There are times when, I could ask the exact same question, but because I'm the one that asked it, it was like sort of aggressive compared to the white man coworker sitting next to me.
No, I understand. I don't make light of it.
I think, Laura, and again, speaking as a white woman, I don't want to give you, advice on how you should handle yourself in these situations, but I will tell you that I do think it speaks to the importance of having representation, right? The more people who are in the room asking just the question in that way, the more comfortable everybody gets with the idea of you asking the question the same way a white man would ask the question, right? I mean, it's a process, and you're right though. I mean, you're 100% right. The same question or the same comment coming from any one of us, coming from you, can be interpreted differently than it can be coming from, a white man, somebody who's sort of more associated with those traditional leadership roles. I would say, one of the things that I'm going to give away all my sort of like secrets here now, but why not? I mean, sometimes I, go into conversations, or before I got this job, when I was in other jobs, we go into conversations and I would sort of make a pact with somebody. Hey, I'm going to say this, like, back me up on that. Right. Or then we would sort of say, I'll do the same for you. Right. So that someone is your advocate in the room. So you're not kind of out there on your own. I think that's a really great thing that women can do for each other. I think men can do it for each other too, or men can do it for women. But if you're going to go into a conversation where that could be the takeaway, that you're the aggressive person in the room, go in with a buddy. I think there's nothing wrong with sort of strategizing around those types of discussions.
I mean, I think going with a buddy makes sense, but there are always people. I'm always keeping tabs on the profile of my people. I mean, I think it's partly a function that I'm like super old now, but it's like if I think someone is being painted wrong, or that I think someone is not being appreciated enough, or not being paid attention to, or their career isn't, like, I go on like a mini mission, right? And so, you know, if you find somebody, you know, like me and get on, you know, my radar, I am going to make sure that when I talk about your story in a morning meeting, I will mention your name, as opposed to, often I don't, but I will make sure that I'll mention your name. I will make sure I am dropping your name into conversations and randomly saying, oh, they're doing a good job on X. And I think that's part of being the, you know, I view that as part of my job, right? To like make sure people are not being underappreciated, under listened to, like that's like, and it isn't something you do necessarily in a day, but especially in, you know, an atmosphere where people aren't in the office, especially in an atmosphere where a lot of people are new, you know, and in this, you know, in my case, new to the times. It's like I view it as part of my job to make sure that if you feel that you are not being listened to in the same way, I make sure that there's, you know, there's a stop to that. And I think that's like increasingly the job of leaders. Not that it always works.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think part of the question is when you don't feel like you have that advocate in a very senior position, then what can you do? And I think there are a few things that are important. And one is not just that sort of you having to take the responsibility for finding that ally to back you up, but making sure as a newsroom, as like a collective group, that people are backing each other up all the time when necessary. And that's something that needs to be happening in small ways all the time to create the culture of it, so that it's not just happening at the moment when somebody who might, you know, have a hard time speaking out has to, you know, those are things that groundwork has to be laid all the time. And I think part of the doing that is talking about it really explicitly, including that bias that, you know, women of color who speak out are considered angrier. I mean, that is something that is very common. And so the more you can kind of make those things explicit so that when they show up, people recognize them and you have different people, different voices stepping in. I think that's really important. I mean, we have a group where it's our union. We have a diversity and inclusion committee that is half union members and half a combination of management and international representation, because our international teams are not in the union. And those are the kinds of things we talk about every single time we meet. And that means that there's sort of this explicit understanding that then shapes the day-to-day. And then there's kind of, it's just easier to provide the backup if everyone's kind of used to that.
And in newsrooms, generally, there are more conversations about it now. So there's more recognition. You know, that doesn't necessarily, you know, help in an immediate sense, but there is much more conversation and recognition.
We have a question from the audience that actually gets at two of the themes we've been talking about. I mean, the question from Kristen is, what is your perspective on whether women should volunteer for boards like diversity and inclusion committees? This is unpaid work and it's mostly women. Should I only look for paid board member opportunities? And I think it kind of gets to, you know, sort of the importance of the diversity and inclusion issues that we're talking about, but also that, like, when do I say no and yes, right? So I'm curious to hear your take on that.
This is the thing we've been talking about a lot, and I'm sort of, my feelings about this are evolving a bit just because of the conversations I'm having with people in our union and in the newsroom, and I'm not sure exactly where I am on all of it, but because I do think it's a little bit of a conundrum that we, you know, people whose voices you want, you don't want to put all the pressure on them, no matter which issue you're talking about. So I think it is tricky, but we've even been talking about it in terms of, it's come up when we do memos for jobs that, we're not paying people to write memos. And is it an issue that it's exclusionary that we're not paying for the time that people are spending, that some people have an easier time spending a day to write a memo looking for a job than others, and can we even that out? So I think they're really, really interesting questions. And I think it's different when you're talking about outside panels versus inside things. But that question of, are those part of everybody's job, or are those things that are kind of extra work and so therefore should be paid inside an organization is a really interesting one that we're having, and lots of organizations are having now, I think.
And I think we're just structurally in a period of evolution around this too. I mean, look, to be honest, so many news organizations were just really behind the curve when it came to diversity and inclusion, right? So we had to create formal processes around this, right? So that includes specific jobs, it includes boards. It was structural in order to make sure that there actually was somebody whose job it was, or who was on a committee, who was tasked with having eyes on this. I think what we're sort of seeing, and we've dealt with this at the AP, Lisa, you know this, I think one of the downsides of that is you draw on the same people kind of over and over and over again. And there's a fatigue, I think, that comes from that. And I think the next phase of this, the evolution, is to make sure that we're not sort of housing the responsibility, in this one group, right? You kind of have to serve on this committee or this board. We have to find ways to make every leader, at the AP has to have this as part of their job function right now, right? And they should be evaluated on that just as much as they are evaluated on their journalism. Again, it's a process of getting to that point, and maybe we do have to take that first step of creating the formal structure that some people do have to be involved in. But if we never kind of turn, if we never say, okay, the next step of this is incorporating this into everybody's job, then we haven't really lived up to the promises that we made to the people who we asked to step forward and serve in those roles initially.
Classic Zoom, unmute yourself. I was just realizing we're actually getting close to being out of time, and I want to get to something that Claire in particular had said. Can we ask them this question again? What advice would you give your younger self? I'm wondering if each of you can take that question and as closing remarks.
We can only share one thing. There's so many things.
Well, no.
I think that my piece of advice that I would give to my younger self is, and it was a piece of advice that eventually I think I did follow, which was, if you see an opportunity, just put your hand up. You actually never know what's going to happen. I'm the executive editor of the Associated Press, when I'm 39, I put my hand up for the job, said, I want to go for this job. I did that when I wanted to be Washington bureau chief. I did that when I wanted to be chief White House correspondent, right? I just put my hand up and said, I want to do this. And you never know what's going to happen. It doesn't always work out, but I think that you have to be kind of fearless and say, I'm going to go for it. And even if I fail, okay, I'm going to get something out of that experience. And then sometimes it works out for you, and that's amazing. And so I think women sometimes put limits on themselves on what they're willing to put their hands up for. So that would be my advice.
I would say that you can embrace your own style and be yourself, which may not be as hard as it was when I started, which is a long time ago. But, when I joined the Wall Street Journal, which is like before most of you were born, I mean, it was 1989. And it felt like everybody was sort of cut of the same mold. Now, of course, that wasn't the case, but it was all men, or mostly men, at the top of the organization. Very hard for women to get to the top. And, everybody had a very, there was an office style, right? And I absolutely didn't feel comfortable with that. And I thought I was going to be gone. And as you know, time went on, and you know, I felt more confident. I felt like I could be myself. And you know, that if you're more comfortable that way, it also allows you to complain more, right? You know, it gives you a certain amount of confidence that, you know, you're not going to change for them. And that would have been the advice I gave myself. But again, there were fewer people around who, you know, there were fewer people around who were, you know, kind of like me. So I'm not sure if it applies as much now, but.
I would say two related things. One is do the things that scare you, even if you're not sure if you want to, because you might learn something that you can apply. You might figure out that you actually really want to do that thing and you're really good at it. And the second related thing is when you get criticism, be really open to it and don't shut down, and think about what you can learn from it, even if you disagree with it, even if you disagree with 95% of it. Take what you can out of it, and don't just kind of be open to it when it comes for you, but look for it. The more you can look for it and the better you are at finding and taking feedback, the more in control you are of your own work and your own feelings about your work and relationships with other people. And the most important thing is that you're learning and enjoying learning, and the more comfortable you are taking feedback, the more you'll learn and the more confident you'll feel about what you're learning.
Great. Listen, we're out of time. I want to thank all of our panelists, including our Xana Fellows, for participating in this conversation. And just moving to the public media pledge drive portion of the event, just a reminder that, you know, we were able to put together this whole Xana Fellows program because of donations from people like you to the Xana Fund in honor of the leadership work that Xana did for all of our industry. So please do donate. And if you're making a donation to SABEW anyway, I would love it if you would select Xana Fund as a place to direct your money. And we appreciate it very much and think they're important conversations to have. So thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference. Next is SABEW's membership meeting, and please go to that. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.